Anatte Karmon from the Fertility Institute of Hawaii, and I am so excited to introduce you guys to Dr. Goulet. So Dr. Goulet is a new physician who's joining us at the Fertility Institute of Hawaii. She'll be seeing patients as well. Why don't you tell us about yourself a little bit?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm excited and thrilled to be here in Hawaii. I was raised in Texas in the Dallas area, which is where I did most of my medical training. I served in the Peace Corps in Micronesia, and you know, once you spend some time out here on the islands, you leave a part of your soul behind. So I've been itching to get back here now for over a decade, so I'm thrilled to be here as well.
Welcome. So today we're going to be talking about the services that we provide for our LGBTQ patients. And if there are people signed in live, feel free to interrupt us with your questions. We'll try and pick up on those and answer them, of course. And you can also kind of leave comments. We can try and answer those later if you do comment on our feed. The video is done. So there are a couple of different types of services that we do offer to our LGBTQ patients. So for those patients who require a sperm source, we do treatments utilizing donor sperm. And there's the option to use anonymous donor sperm as well as directed donor sperm, so somebody that you know. There's also the option to use donor eggs along with or without gestation carriers. And you can also similarly use an anonymous donor, or you can use somebody that you know. You can also, in terms of a gestational carrier, the gestational carriers often used interchangeably with surrogates, a surrogate or a gestational carrier. And you can also use someone you know for that, or you can use somebody through an agency. Gestational carriers typically, just to clarify, are not necessarily anonymous. You know, they are they can be recruited through an agency, but then you kind of do develop a relationship with that person who's carrying that pregnancy for you.
And just to add on to that, if you're other services we provide, if you're reproductive age and you're thinking of transitioning for our transgender population, we do offer fertility preservation so that you can do that before you start your hormones, so that you don't have to worry about stopping hormones later on in order to build a family.
That's true. And we also, she's not joining us right now, but we also have Dr. Sloan Chen, who is a board-certified pediatric and adolescent gynecologist, and she does do a lot of work with our trans patients in terms of assisting with transition, hormonal therapy, as well as potentially surgery such as hysterectomy, if that's something being required for those patients who are transitioning. So we kind of do a lot of the fertility work, but we also have services for people who are not looking for fertility right now necessarily.
Yeah.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about where to get these sperm and eggs and things like that, if you want to start out.
The wonderful thing is that there are many commercial sperm banks and egg banks available to individuals nowadays. There are more sperm banks than I can list. There's, you know, the big five:
True,
Seattle, California, Fairfax, Zytex, but any sperm bank, if you find the one who is meant to be the DNA donor for your baby, as long as they're FDA approved, we are happy to help coordinate shipment and the inseminations for your treatment.
Yeah, so and also on our website, if you go to our website and click on fertility treatments, donor sperm, you will actually see, and you scroll to the bottom, there's a lot of information about donor sperm there. If you scroll to the bottom of that, you'll see a number of, I mean, it's not an exhaustive list, not all of them, but you'll see a few of the most popular sperm banks listed there. And then you can opt to click on the link, see what you have there. I think with some of the banks, in order to see everything that they have, you probably have to register with them. There may be some nominal fees. I think it depends on the bank.
Yeah, I think most of them let you create a login for free, but then a lot of the additional perks of looking at the profile is fee-based.
Right, yeah. And there are some things that you do want to pay attention to with the donor sperm. We'll get into that as well. But I also wanted to bring up the issue of directed donors. So many patients come in asking for, a friend of theirs that they prefer to do inseminations with a friend, and that I think is always a great idea. But there are some additional things obviously to consider. So first off, there's we have a contract, which is sort of just a boilerplate contract, which essentially it's not a contract, actually it's a consent form. We have sort of a boilerplate consent form, which the directed donor signs, saying that he's providing this sperm for use for somebody else to build a family. However, if you want and we recommend considering a more exhaustive type of legal contract, then there are attorneys who can work on contracts for you, and of course we could give you the names of those. So there are some additional complications with utilizing directed donors that you should consider legal. And then there's also the kind of screening that needs to be done for those donors, which basically includes physical exam and special type of blood work. And we can do that. The blood work we need to do, the physical exam can be done by us or by the directed donor's own physician, as long as they kind of sign off on the appropriate paperwork that we can provide.
And directed donors, it can be longer to go through treatment, because when we use a donor that you're not sexually intimate with, there can be a quarantine period for that sperm. So sometimes for couples who are eager to get pregnant as soon as possible, choosing a sperm bank is the faster option.
Yeah. In terms of the quarantine period, so it does vary by area and by state. So you guys should, if you're looking at this from elsewhere, not from Hawaii, then you definitely need to look specifically at those guidelines. In our state, there is no quarantine requirement. Yeah. So I think that the major issue more so with using directed donors is oftentimes is that the lab work needs to be done within 7 days of the collection. And the lab work is not covered by insurance. It can be a few $100s. And so whenever they come in, oftentimes people want multiple collections, but if the directed donor does collections over the course of a few weeks, sometimes the couple has to, pay for that lab testing more than once. So there are some things to consider. It sort of sounds like I'm discouraging people from using a directed donor. I'm totally not. I think it's a great idea.
It's a great option, especially if you want to use the brother of your partner.
Right.
Wait.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful option, and we do it quite often, but there are just some, extra things to consider. Whereas with anonymous donation, oftentimes it's all already kind of been done. All the screening's been done, everything's been done, that sperm's all just ready to go. It needs to be shipped.
But there's perks to that too, because they've already done the genetic carrier screening, which is a big, it can be an expensive part of selecting a donor if that's something that you're interested in. And the nice thing is it's on hand. So typically you can contact them and have it shipped to us, the next day.
Right. In terms of what to look for, people always ask me this when they're looking for, especially with anonymous donors. Okay, so obviously I'm not going to tell you what donor to choose. You choose whoever you're most comfortable with. You will see most of the banks provide baby pictures. Some will provide, I think, adult photos as well. You'll see a lot about ethnicity, medical background, and all that type of stuff. So you'll be provided with that information. Basically, you have a lot of information, just not the actual identity of that donor.
Although some donor banks are offering sort of an OpenID for your child. So after your child is born and they turn over 18, there is the possibility for them to reach out to who their donor was and to have a short conversation. It's not meant for them to establish a relationship, but just for them to learn a little more about who their donor was.
Yeah, that's very cool, and I think a lot of that's kind of the trend of many banks today. So we may see kind of more and more of that in the future as well. And not to get too sidetracked, but in the end, I think you have to keep in mind that with genetic testing, things like 23andMe, which have become very, very popular, Ancestry.com, and that sort of thing, people are doing genetic testing, and even interrupted donor, or I'm sorry, even if the anonymous donor is not, has not done genetic testing, oftentimes their family members may have done genetic testing. And so if your offspring, choose to do that type of testing in the future, then they can always get in touch. Potentially, they may be able to get in touch with those donors who, did not intend to be gotten in touch with. So that is kind of a very different playing field, I think, in the future that people do have to consider. Anonymous today
may not be anonymous tomorrow.
May not be anonymous tomorrow. So that's an important point. But I think it's sort of for the best. I think it's a good thing. But it is something to realize. But so what to keep in mind about when you're looking at the banks? You definitely, there are a few things you want to look at. So again, ethnicity and all that stuff is obviously completely up to you.
Yeah.
You want to look at whether they've done genetic carrier screening, as Dr. Goulet mentioned. So genetic carrier screening is important because if it's a recessive disease, that means if you're a carrier for the same thing that the sperm donor is a carrier for, then essentially you could have a child with a disorder. And if it's a severe disorder, many people would want to avoid that. So genetic carrier screening is an important part, and the banks are very different in terms of how much genetic carrier screening is being done, and whether it's really being done at all. There's some tests that all the banks are doing for some of the more common diseases, but not everyone is testing for all the rare diseases under the sun. You do want to pay attention to that, and then you want to pay attention to if they're flagged, if they're positive for any of those genetic conditions. If they are, that's okay. You can still use that donor, but then we would want to test source, so presumably you, if we're using your eggs, we would test you to see if you are carried for that same condition. If you guys are not carriers for the same condition, then that sperm donor is fine to choose.
Frequent questions I get is, what kind of sperm do I need to have sent? Because there's some that are IUI, ICI, ICSI, and it can be confusing, washed, unwashed, and it depends on the type of fertility treatment you're going through. In general, if you're doing just an insemination, something that says IUI is preferred, we can work with sperm that says ICI, which is unwashed, but in general, we prefer the pre-washed sperm. ICSI, ICSI, is reserved specifically for IVF. So if you're going through IVF, then you can get any of those 3 types of sperm sent, and we can use all of those. Another question that I get is, how many vials do I need to order? And that is also a personal decision. We recommend that you have them shipped 1 at a time. But you might want to think about, well, in the future, if you're going to build a family where you want siblings, how many extra vials do you want to purchase on hand? We are more than happy to take credit if you get pregnant on your first insemination, but statistically speaking, it might take 3 or 4 rounds. So if you're planning on having 2 or 3 kids, it might be worth thinking about buying several extra vials.
Yeah, absolutely. And also shipping obviously is an expense. So sometimes if you ship more than 1, that can make sense because, you save a little bit on shipping, and then you have some extra left over if you do want siblings in the future. But on the other hand, you don't want to ship too many, because if you do achieve a pregnancy, you'll end up having to storage on those, or trying to kind of figure out what to do. So I think somewhere between 1 to 3 vials shipping over is what the majority of people are doing. Unfortunately, there are no sperm banks in Hawaii right now, so there are no anonymous donor sperm banks here. We can bank sperm. Just to be clear, we bank sperm for patients and for patients who are freezing sperm for various reasons, like for example, trans patients who are undergoing transitioning, or cancer patients, or people vasectomy, or whatever it is. We can bank their sperm here, but we don't have an anonymous donor bank that you can essentially use the sperm from.
And that sperm gets shipped to a long-term storage facility.
Yeah, and so you're looking at shipping from the mainland, but honestly, buying sperm from the mainland is sort of like buying shoes online at this point. I always tell my patients that it's pretty straightforward and ships, pretty quickly, faster than shoes. So, and you don't have to time it with your ovulation because the sperm arrives frozen, and we're able to keep that frozen for you. So it doesn't have to be sort of an exact timing. I do have some patients ask about home inseminations as well. And home inseminations are, an option for patients if they choose to undergo that. We don't necessarily support home insemination in that, we sort of, if you're doing it on your own, you're doing it on your own. So and I think that the success rates with home insemination are variable. They're definitely lower than if you're doing intrauterine insemination with us. But typically what you want to do if you're looking at home insemination is utilize a bank, which will ship directly to you.
And not all of them will. Some of them.
Not all of them will. Yeah. So some of them will. So you want to look for that, and then you want to look at their protocol of how you would need to thaw it. It's definitely not our recommendation, but of course I understand that there are some patients who want to kind of start out with that.
Back to the lab testing, I know you had mentioned genetic carrier screening, but another thing that's kind of important is the CMV status. So cytomegalovirus is what CMV stands for, and it's a virus that belongs to the herpes group of viruses. And in adults and children, if we catch it, it's not a big deal. It's a cold, but if a pregnant woman catches it for the first time in pregnancy, it can cause some severe developmental defects in the fetus. And so we try to test the women before you order your sperm so that oh, I'm CMV positive, I've already been exposed, I'm immune, so I can order whatever sperm I want, CMV positive or CMV negative. On the other hand, for women who test negative, we strongly prefer that they choose a CMV negative source to minimize the risk of exposure during early pregnancy.
Yeah, that's an important point. So the genetic carrier screening, the CMV, that's the stuff we really have you guys take a look at. And the type of sperm as well that you're ordering. If you're doing in vitro fertilization, really any type of sperm. If you're doing insemination, preferable to order washed for IUI. But again, we do have some leeway with the types of sperm, so you would just kind of need to talk to us about that. Let's see, maybe moving on to egg donation. So some of our patients, obviously not just LGBTQ patients, but lots of people will require the use of egg donors for various reasons. So egg donation can be done in a similar fashion. You can get eggs nowadays from an egg bank, okay, or we can actually put a donor through a cycle. And then you would get all of the eggs that we retrieve from one particular cycle. That's typically referred to as a fresh cycle versus using frozen eggs from a bank. And so the most common type of egg donor cycles are going to be anonymous egg donor. So either through a bank, or the fresh donors will also be anonymous. You can either kind of go through us and use donors through us. You can also go through an agency, and we can cycle those donors for you. And obviously the prices and the success rates differ considerably for some of these things, and that should be personalized to you. You can also use a directed donor. So you can use somebody that you know as well, and there's going to be similar types of screening. Now, a few things to keep in mind about the directed donors. Many times patients will want to use family members of their partner or things like that, right? However, you really do need to pay attention to, the age and the fertility of those directed donors, because the success rate of fertility treatment is very, very much dependent upon the fertility of the female donor. Less so with the sperm, which is it's just not fair. It's not fair, just the way that it is. So that's why you didn't really hear me talk too much about, well, you got to make sure that it's a good sperm. I mean, the guy's got to have some sperm for sure. So we want to make sure that, he has some sperm there and it's okay. But it's much, much more, I think relevant for the egg donor. If you have anything to add about that. But.
It depends. In general, we would prefer individuals who are younger than 30, but there's some leeway there. The healthier, cleaner living that they have, generally, the healthier their eggs are as well. So, if your best friend smokes 2 packs a day, it may not be the best egg donor for you.
Right. And then there's also the option to use embryos. Okay, so
I think that's a great option.
Yes,
I think that's a fantastic option.
Yeah, so embryos that have already been created utilizing another couple's egg and sperm, or utilizing another egg donor or sperm donor that have already been created. These are typically embryos that that previously belonged to couples that had extra embryos available and they've completed their families, and now instead of discarding the embryos, they'd like to donate those embryos to other families. And so that's a great option for people who are thinking of using egg donor and sperm donor. They can actually utilize embryo donors, and so we have a program. There are some other national as well.
Yeah, you can go through an agency, but I'm really proud of the fact that we've supported that for a long time. And so we have our own embryo pool here, if that is something you're interested in.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I mean, nothing's easy, but that's one of the easier kind of ways to go, because half the sort of work has already been done. Okay, so it's a little bit more straightforward. On the other hand, keep in mind the success rates are variable, because these are patients who've really donated their embryos and they carry all their fertility issues and their medical problems along with them. So that is different than if you're just utilizing an egg donor who kind of has the perfect fertility, so to speak, right? The other thing, so in particular for same-sex female couples, another thing to keep in mind is who will carry the pregnancy and co-IVF, or reciprocal IVF as it's often called. And that's the process where we utilize the eggs from one patient and a sperm source, and then put the embryos into the other patient's uterus. And so that is a nice way for the couple to sort of to feel connected and be involved. There's no difference in success rate. People always ask, is it okay because we're using, it's my uterus, her eggs, or whatever, the same exact success rates. And obviously the success, like I said, depends very heavily upon the egg donor, right? But also depends upon the uterus and what the cycle looks like in that regard. Insurance typically doesn't cover reciprocal IVF, unfortunately, but some patients who, for example, if you have embryos left over, then through a cycle that you've completed with insurance, then you can pay out of pocket just for that transfer portion for co-IVF, and that's going to be less expensive than if you kind of have to do it from the beginning. So obviously cost is definitely a consideration for a lot of people, but I think co-IVF is a great idea for those who are interested in that. In terms of surrogacy, so we use kind of gestational carrier and surrogate interchangeably. The gestational carriers usually come from agencies. There are a few different agencies that we work with here in Hawaii, and so we can help you get to the best agency for you, or certainly the agencies refer to us as well. And I think that getting on a waiting list for gestational carrier is really the biggest step, because it can be, there's somewhat of a wait, okay? And it depends on, your exact needs and, what exactly you're looking for in a gestational carrier, obviously. But I think that in general, for most patients, egg donors are a little bit more available than gestational carriers. Similarly, some people will already have a carrier in mind. It may be a family member or friend. And so we can do that screening for the carrier to make sure that they're appropriate. The big things that we're looking for with carriers, okay, we want to make sure that this carrier has really completed her family, that she has had children of her own, that she knows what she's getting into in terms of pregnancy. You typically don't want to utilize a carrier who's never been pregnant. And you want to make sure that the carrier doesn't have any, serious medical conditions that would be dangerous in pregnancy. And that overall she had healthy and happy pregnancies, and that she's kind of happy to really be doing this. Those are really the most important things. And of course, then from the other standpoint, we kind of do all the testing where we look at her uterus and her hormone levels and all that as well.
And there is a psych evaluation involved with the gestational carriers that aren't as big of a component when we're looking at a commercial donor from an anonymous egg bank. But, everybody's looking out for your interests. So we want to make sure that your gestational carrier is going to take good care of her pregnancy when she is pregnant.
Right. And then moving forward to the different types of testing that we'll often do for LGBTQ patients. I mean, honestly, it's very similar to, the testing that we do for any type of single patient or patients who come in, in any type of couple, really. So we will typically evaluate the ovarian reserve with ultrasound and blood work of the patient who is interested in utilizing their eggs. And we'll do what's called a saline ultrasound to evaluate the uterus of patients who are looking to carry or to undergo inseminations. An HSG or hysterosalpingogram can be done to evaluate the fallopian tubes. And a semen analysis, of course, for those who are looking to donate sperm, or for those patients who are going to be utilizing an egg donor and a gestational carrier. Now, I'll mention a few things about that. So some patients who come in, especially those, for example, who are not planning on undergoing IVF quite yet, but like a same-sex female couple, never tried to get pregnant before, would like to undergo insemination. So they make a good point of saying, I've never tried to get pregnant. I don't think I have any fertility problems. Do I really need to do all this testing? And honestly, the answer is no. You don't have to do all the testing. It's going to be a discussion and an option. We can try and make the cycle as natural as possible, if you'd like, and kind of forgo some of the testing and just do kind of natural inseminations. The reason why many patients, and I think most of our patients, but not all, will opt to do testing and will opt to, potentially utilize additional fertility therapy, is because the donor sperm is expensive. Whether you use directed donors or whether you use anonymous donors, there's a significant cost. And so, sometimes people feel like, well, if there's that chance that my fallopian tubes are blocked, or there's that chance that
why did I just do 3 IUIs?
Yeah,
and it wouldn't, because both tubes were blocked. So.
Right. So I think a lot of patients, once they kind of understand that and look at the costs associated with it, they kind of choose to undergo some of the basic testing. But it is flexible. Some patients kind of prefer to avoid some of the more interventional tests. Some are kind of like, let's just do everything. I want to know everything, make sure everything's okay. I've had some patients opt to do a few inseminations, and then if it doesn't work, then they do some tests. So it's all sort of up for discussion. I don't want you to feel that we necessarily push you into one thing or another. As long as it is, I'm willing to literally do anything as long as it's safe and has some chance of working. Then it's ultimately going to be up to you, as long as you understand kind of what you're getting yourself into. So. And then insurance. Does insurance cover certain things? Insurance covers certain things. Yes. So.
They'll cover the workup in general. So those testings that we just mentioned to evaluate the cavity, to evaluate the ovarian reserve, those hormone profiles, we often check the thyroid levels. Sometimes we'll need to check other hormones. That testing is generally covered.
Right. And then, inseminations may be covered. Many plans will cover insemination. The one thing that's like never covered, right, is the actual, purchasing of donor sperm, right, which is an expense. So keep that in mind. But some of the treatments, like some inseminations, may be covered. And then, some of the things involved, like ultrasounds that go along with the treatment, sometimes are covered and sometimes are not. So we kind of have to look at that. If you are going to be doing in vitro fertilization because you've had multiple unsuccessful inseminations, then some of the insurance companies will cover that, okay, but some will not. So it's variable. Yeah.
Some of you may be aware of that there is a law here in Hawaii that requires fertility coverage, but the law unfortunately only covers fertility coverage for married heterosexual couples, I believe. And so there have been some insurance companies who have been willing to go above and beyond, but unfortunately not all of them do.
Right. So many of them will cover, even though by law they don't have to, but many of the insurance companies just go by the letter of the law. And the other things that typically don't get coverage, right? The use of a gestational carrier is usually out of pocket. And typically with egg donation, there may be some coverage towards utilizing an egg donor. It depends on the plan and depends on the situation, but there may be some coverage for patients who need egg donation for various reasons. But if you're using an egg donor with a gestational carrier, there's no coverage for that. And then I think lastly, just to talk about what you can do to kind of prepare for this. I mean, the main thing is just set up a consult. You don't necessarily need to set up a consult way ahead of time. It doesn't take too long to get this stuff done. Well, I should say if you are thinking of using a gestational carrier and an egg donor, that does take a longer time. So that's probably something, you may want to come in at least 6 months to a year before you really are, set on doing it. If you are same-sex female partnership, looking for sperm donors, typically the testing doesn't take very long. I mean, you can come in, a month or 2 months before you want to get started. Other things to prepare would be if you are planning on using your own eggs, planning on using your uterus, you can take folic acid. So multivitamin with folic acid would be one thing to do. And if you are a smoker, quit smoking. You should quit smoking anyway, but smoking, smoking cuts the success rate of fertility treatments by half at least. So those are the things that you kind of want to start to do in preparation.
Yeah.
So, I don't know that we have any questions. It doesn't look like anybody's writing in, but feel free to later on kind of ask us any questions. We can answer them later in our comments feed. But I don't know if there's any other stuff, but I think we kind of went over the gist of it. Thank you so much for joining us. And then certainly we're happy to write in and answer any questions you might have. Aloha.